They did not call it death. They called it the Great Passage, and for thousands of years, in the deepest chambers of the Egyptian temples, initiates were led through it deliberately, not metaphorically, not symbolically, actually. They were placed in a stone sarcophagus, in complete darkness, in complete silence, and left there. For 3 days. What happened to them in those 3 days was never written down. It was never recorded on any wall, never preserved in any papyrus, never transmitted in any text that survived, because what happened could not be written. It could only be lived. But the initiates who emerged were never the same, not changed in the way that experiences change people, changed in the way that death changes people, because in every way that mattered, they had died and come back with something they did not have before, something that no amount of study, no amount of philosophy, no amount of ordinary human experience could have given them. Tonight, we go into the chamber together to understand what happened in the Egyptian initiation chamber. You first need to understand something about the ancient Egyptian mind. The Egyptians did not think about death the way we do. For us, death is an ending, the cessation of experience, the termination of the self, something to be feared, avoided, postponed for as long as possible. For the ancient Egyptians, death was a doorway, not a metaphor for a doorway, an actual threshold between one mode of existence and another. And like all thresholds, it could be crossed consciously or unconsciously. Most people crossed it unconsciously, carried through by the current of biological necessity, without preparation, without understanding, without knowing what was on the other side, or how to navigate it. The entire Egyptian funerary tradition, the Book of the Dead, the elaborate rituals of preparation, the careful preservation of the body, were all oriented toward one goal, helping the soul cross the threshold consciously, with full awareness, with full knowledge of what it was entering, with the navigational tools it would need to find its way through what the Egyptians called the duat, the in-between realm, the space between death and whatever comes after. But the mystery schools of Egypt understood something else, something more radical, something that separated the initiates from the ordinary practitioners of Egyptian religion. They understood that you did not have to wait for biological death to cross the threshold consciously. You could do it while still alive. You could enter the duat deliberately, navigate it with full awareness, and return, carrying back what you had encountered there, not as memory, not as vision or dream or altered state, as direct knowledge, as gnosis. The Egyptian word for this practice was sak, the passage, and the technology they developed for inducing it was the most carefully guarded secret in the entire ancient world. The preparation for the initiation began months before the actual event, sometimes years. The candidate was put through a rigorous process of physical, emotional, and mental purification, specific dietary restrictions, specific physical practices, specific meditative disciplines, all designed to do one thing: to thin the veil between ordinary waking consciousness and the deeper layers of awareness that the Egyptians believed lay beneath it. The way you thin ice by warming it slowly until it becomes permeable. The candidate was also taught extensively. They were given detailed maps of the duat, descriptions of what they would encounter, names of the guardians at each threshold, words of power that would allow them to pass, not as mythology, as literal navigational tools, the way a sailor is given charts and instruments, before being sent into unknown waters, because the Egyptians were not sending their initiates into a symbolic landscape. They were sending them into something real, something that had been mapped by thousands of initiates before them, whose reports had been compared and cross-referenced and refined over thousands of years into a precise and detailed cartography of what lies beyond ordinary consciousness. And then, when the preparation was complete, when the priests determined that the candidate was ready, they were led into the innermost chamber of the temple, a room that most people in the entire history of ancient Egypt never entered, a room that had no windows, no light, no sound from the outside world, a room with a single stone sarcophagus at its centre. The candidate was prepared, anointed with specific oils, dressed in specific garments, given specific instructions for what to do. When the darkness became total, and then they were placed inside, the lid was closed and the priests left. For 3 days, the initiate lay in the darkness, alone, in silence so complete that the sound of their own heartbeat became the loudest thing in the universe, in darkness so total that the difference between open eyes and closed eyes disappeared entirely. And in that darkness, in that silence, something began to happen. The Egyptian priests understood this progression intimately. They had mapped it in detail. The first phase they called the death of the small self, the period of panic and resistance, as the ordinary ego, the personality constructed from memory and social role and habitual pattern, lost its grip on consciousness because the ego is maintained by input, by the constant stream of sensation and interaction. That confirms its existence and reinforces its boundaries. Remove the input, and the ego begins to dissolve, not instantly, not painlessly, but inevitably, like a sandcastle as the tide comes in. The initiates had been prepared for this. They had been told what to expect. They had been given specific practices to work with the dissolution rather than against it. Not to fight the panic, not to suppress the fear, but to witness it, to observe the death of the small self, from somewhere that was not itself small, from a place of awareness that was larger than what was dying. The second phase the priest called the crossing, the moment when the dissolution of the ordinary self reached a critical point, and something that had been obscured by it became suddenly, overwhelmingly present. The initiates described this moment in different ways, as a light that appeared in the darkness, not a physical light, a light that seemed to come from no source and illuminate everything, including things that were not visible to physical eyes, as an expansion in which the boundaries of the self that had felt so solid and so permanent simply were not there anymore. As a recognition, the most common word used, not discovery, not revelation, recognition, as if something that had always been known but forgotten was suddenly remembered, and what was remembered was not a fact, not a piece of information, not a theological belief about the afterlife, something more intimate than any of those, something that the initiates consistently described with the same simple statement: I did not die, not I survived, not I came through, I did not die, because what they encountered in the crossing was something that had no relationship with death, something that could not die because it had never been born, something that existed before the body and would exist after it, not as belief, not as hope, as direct experience, as the most certain thing they had ever known, more certain than the existence of their own hands, more certain than the fact of their own breathing. The awareness that was aware was not mortal, had never been mortal, would never be mortal, and the 3 days in the stone sarcophagus had simply created the conditions under which this recognition could no longer be avoided. There is a moment that every initiate described, not during the 3 days in the darkness, after, days or weeks after emerging from the chamber, when the world had reasserted itself, and ordinary life had resumed, and the memory of what had happened inside had begun to soften at the edges. The way all memories soften, they would be doing something completely ordinary, eating a meal, walking through the marketplace, watching the sun set over the Nile, and without warning, without effort, without any intention on their part, it would return, not the memory of it, the thing itself, that quality of presence, that opening, that recognition, arriving unbidden in the middle of ordinary life. Like a door swinging open in a wall you had forgotten contained a door. And for a moment, sometimes a long moment, the boundary between the ordinary self and what lay beneath it would become transparent again, not as vivid as it had been in the chamber, not as total, but unmistakably the same thing, the same quality, the same recognition. I am not this, I am what is aware of this, and that awareness has no edges, has no beginning, has no end. The priests called these moments visitations, and they considered them the true fruit of the initiation, not the 3 days in the darkness. The visitations that followed for the rest of the initiate's life, arriving without warning in the most ordinary moments, to remind them of what they actually were, beneath everything that had been added, beneath the name and the history and the accumulated weight of a human life. I want to tell you something now, something I have been building toward. Through everything we have explored tonight, you have had visitations. Not because you have been through an Egyptian initiation, not because you have spent 3 days in a stone sarcophagus, but because the awareness the initiation was designed to reveal is not somewhere else. It is not something that has to be earned or achieved or unlocked through extraordinary means. It is here, right now. It has always been here. You have felt it in moments of unexpected stillness, when the noise of the ordinary mind went quiet and something underneath it was briefly, undeniably present, in moments of profound beauty, when something in the landscape or the music or the face of someone you loved opened something in you that you could not name but recognized, in moments of grief so complete that the ordinary self had nothing left to say. And in that silence, something else, something vast and quiet, was simply there. These were not random experiences. These were visitations, the act making itself known through the gaps in the ordinary that circumstance occasionally creates. The first thing that happens when a human being is placed in total darkness and total silence is that the ordinary mind panics, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, as the minutes become hours and the hours lose their edges and time itself begins to dissolve. The mind reaches for something to hold on to and finds nothing. No light to orient by, no sound to anchor to, no sensation of movement or temperature change, to remind the nervous system that the world still exists. Just the darkness, and the silence, and the sound of breathing, and the heartbeat, and the thoughts, which at first are ordinary thoughts, plans, memories, anxieties, the mental furniture of everyday life, rearranging itself nervously in the dark. But as the hours deepen, something begins to shift. The ordinary thoughts lose their urgency, not because they resolve, not because the mind finds peace, but because, without any external input to feed them, they begin to exhaust themselves like a fire that has consumed all available fuel and begins to burn lower and lower until only embers remain. Modern sensory deprivation research, conducted in the late 20th century, has documented what happens to human consciousness when external input is removed for extended periods. In the first hours, the brain attempts to compensate for the lack of input. By generating its own, geometric patterns appear in the visual field. Sounds arise from silence. Sensations move across the skin with no physical cause. The brain, deprived of its ordinary diet of sensation, begins to feed on itself. But the researchers found something else, something that the Egyptian priests had known for thousands of years. If the deprivation continues beyond a certain threshold, something changes. The compensatory activity stops. The internally generated noise quiets. And what remains is something the researchers struggled to describe. A quality of awareness that was, paradoxically, more clear than ordinary waking consciousness. Not less, more. As if the removal of all external input had revealed something that was always present beneath it, something that ordinary experience, with its constant flood of sensation and thought and social demand, had been continuously obscuring. The initiates who emerged from the sarcophagus were greeted by the priests with a specific phrase, not congratulations, not welcome back, a question, what did you see? And the initiates, almost without exception, gave the same answer, not in the same words, not with the same images or metaphors, but pointing at the same thing, every time, across centuries of initiations, across thousands of individual accounts, collected and compared and studied by the priests, who spent their entire lives tending this tradition. The same recognition, every time, that consciousness does not end, that what you are at the deepest level is not something that can be extinguished, that death, as ordinarily understood, is a transition, not a termination. Now, before we go deeper into what the initiates reported, I want to draw your attention to something that happened in the 20th century, that the ancient priests could not have anticipated, but that points, uncomfortably, precisely, in the same direction. In 1975, a physician named Raymond Moody published a book called Life After Life. In it, he documented the accounts of people who had been clinically dead, whose hearts had stopped, whose brains had ceased to function, and who had been resuscitated and had returned with memories of what had occurred during the period when they were, by every medical definition, not alive. The accounts were remarkably consistent, a sense of leaving the physical body, observing it from above, moving through a dark tunnel toward a light, encountering presences, sometimes described as deceased relatives, sometimes as beings of light, that communicated without words, a panoramic review of the life just lived, a boundary or threshold, beyond which they understood they could not pass. and return, reluctant, almost always reluctant, because what they had encountered on the other side was not frightening. It was the opposite of frightening. It was described consistently as more real than ordinary life, more vivid, more present, more alive, as if ordinary waking consciousness was a dim and partial version of what they had briefly touched. Moody's book was dismissed by much of the medical establishment as wishful thinking, as hallucination, as the dying brain producing comforting illusions in its final moments of activity. But the research did not stop, it multiplied. Cardiologist Pim van Lommel conducted a 10-year prospective study of cardiac arrest survivors in the Netherlands, published in The Lancet in 2001, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. He found that 18% of patients who had been successfully resuscitated reported clear memories of experiences during the period when their hearts had stopped, when their brains showed no measurable activity, when they were, by every clinical measure, dead. The experiences they reported matched what Moody had documented 25 years earlier, with a consistency that could not be easily dismissed. Van Lommel's conclusion was carefully worded, as a scientist must be, but it pointed in a direction that mainstream medicine has still not fully absorbed. That consciousness may not be produced by the brain, that the brain may function more like a receiver than a generator, tuning in to consciousness, the way a radio tunes in to a signal, and that when the radio stops working, the signal does not stop. It simply is no longer being received by that particular instrument. This is exactly what the Egyptian priests taught 3,000 years before Raymond Moody, 3,000 years before Pim van Lommel. They had their own research methodology, their own way of collecting and comparing accounts, their own way of testing hypotheses about the nature of consciousness and death. It was called the initiation, and the data they collected over thousands of years of carefully conducted and carefully observed initiations pointed them toward the same conclusion: that what you are is not what you think you are, that the identity you carry through ordinary life, the name, the history, the personality, is a temporary configuration, a particular shape the water has taken, not the water itself, and that what the water actually is, what consciousness actually is, at its deepest and most fundamental level, does not end, cannot end, because it was never born. The Egyptian word for this understanding was Akh, the immortal divine self, the aspect of the human being that exists before the body and after it, that is not diminished by suffering, not enhanced by pleasure, not born with the first breath, not extinguished with the last. The Akh was not something you had to earn, not something you had to become. It was something you had to remember. And the 3 days in the sarcophagus were the most powerful remembering technology the ancient world ever devised, not because darkness and silence produce the Akh, but because they remove, with extraordinary efficiency, everything that was obscuring it. The sarcophagus was not a burial chamber. It was a laboratory, the most sophisticated consciousness laboratory in human history. And what it reliably produced, in candidate after candidate, century after century, was not a belief about immortality, an experience of it, direct, undeniable, permanent. There is a question that arises naturally here, a question that the skeptical mind, and I say this with respect for the skeptical mind, will want to ask. How do we know that what the initiates experienced was real? How do we know it was not simply the product of an oxygen-deprived brain, a stressed nervous system, a mind pushed to its limits by isolation and darkness, generating elaborate internal experiences that felt profound, but were ultimately just neurochemistry, just the brain doing what brains do when deprived of input for long enough? This is a fair question. It deserves a serious answer. The first part of the answer is this: the experiences reported by Egyptian initiates, near-death experiences in modern hospitals, practitioners of deep meditation across every tradition, and people who have undergone profound experiences of expanded consciousness, through whatever means, share a core of characteristics that is extraordinarily consistent across cultures, across centuries, across completely different methods of induction. The sense of expanded identity, the dissolution of the boundary between self and world, the encounter with the quality of awareness. That feels more real than ordinary consciousness, not less real, more. The recognition that consciousness is primary, and the permanent transformation that follows. Not a temporary altered state, a permanent shift in the baseline of how reality is perceived. People who have had these experiences do not come back saying it was interesting. They come back saying it was the most real thing that has ever happened to them. More real than birth, more real than love, more real than anything in ordinary waking life. And they are changed measurably, verifiably, permanently. Their relationship with death changes, not because they now believe in an afterlife, because they have directly experienced something in themselves that does not feel mortal. Their relationship with fear changes, not because they have become fearless, but because the deepest fear, the one that underlies all other fears, the fear of ceasing to exist, has been addressed at its root, not intellectually, experientially. Their relationship with other people changes. Because when you have directly experienced the dissolution of the boundary between self and other, the separation that ordinarily feels so solid becomes transparent. And what you see through the transparency is something that looks remarkably like what every wisdom tradition has been pointing at for thousands of years, that the awareness in the other person is the same awareness that is looking out through your eyes, that at the deepest level there is only one thing, appearing as many. The second part of the answer to the skeptical question is more subtle and perhaps more important. Even if we cannot prove, with the instruments currently available to science, that what the initiates experienced was objectively real, in the sense that the chair you are sitting on is real, there is something else to consider. The question of what real means. We assume, without usually examining the assumption, that ordinary waking consciousness is the baseline for reality, that what we perceive in the ordinary waking state is simply reality, and that anything beyond it is a departure from reality, a deviation, an aberration, a hallucination. But this assumption has never been justified. It has simply been inherited. The way most assumptions are inherited, without examination, without inquiry, without asking, what if the ordinary waking state is itself a highly filtered, highly edited, radically simplified version of something vastly larger? What if ordinary consciousness is not the baseline, but the limitation? And what the initiates in the sarcophagus encountered, what the near-death experiences encountered, what the deep meditators encounter, is not a departure from reality, but a closer approach to it. This is what the Egyptian tradition claimed, with extraordinary confidence, based on thousands of years of direct investigation. The ordinary waking state, the state you are in right now as you listen to these words, is not the fullest available experience of reality. It is a narrowing of it, a necessary narrowing, for the practical purposes of navigating physical existence, but a narrowing nonetheless. And the initiation, the 3 days in the stone chamber, was a technology for temporarily reversing that narrowing, for expanding consciousness back toward something closer to what it actually is, before the filters were applied, before the nervous system learned to edit, before the culture taught you what was real and what was not. The Hermetic tradition expressed this through the principle of correspondence. As above, so below. As within, so without. The structure of the inner world corresponds to the structure of the outer. And what the initiates discovered in the inner world, in the silence and darkness of the stone chamber, was not a private fantasy. It was a map of something real, something that existed independently of their experience of it. The way a map of a continent exists independently of any individual traveller who uses it to navigate. The continent is there, whether or not you have seen it. The map simply helps you find your way. And the Egyptian initiation was the most powerful map-making technology for the inner continent of consciousness that the ancient world ever developed. There is one more dimension of the Egyptian initiation that I have not yet told you, something the priests understood. That goes beyond the experience itself, beyond the recognition of immortality, beyond the dissolution of the fear of death, something that the initiates only discovered after they emerged from the chamber, after the 3 days were over, after they had been welcomed back by the priests and given food and water and light, and time to reorient themselves to the ordinary world. What they discovered was that something had changed in the way they perceived everything. Not just death, not just consciousness, everything. The way light fell on stone, the way another person's face looked when they really looked at it, the way a simple meal tasted after 3 days of nothing, the way the air felt entering the lungs, when breathing was no longer something taken for granted. Everything was different. Not in the sense that the world had changed. The world was exactly as it had been. The same stones, the same sky, the same people, but the one perceiving it was perceiving from somewhere new, from somewhere deeper, from a place that had been cleared of something that had previously obscured it. The way a window looks different after years of accumulated grime have been removed. The glass is the same glass, the view is the same view, but suddenly everything is more vivid, more present, more real. The priests had a name for this condition. They called it the twice born, not born again in the religious sense. Born twice, once from the body of the mother, once from the stone chamber. The first birth gave you a body and a name and a place in the world. The second birth gave you something else entirely, a direct and unmediated relationship with what you actually are, beneath the body, beneath the name, beneath the entire accumulated structure of a human life. And this second birth changed everything about how the first birth was experienced. The initiates did not become otherworldly. They did not retreat from ordinary life. They did not lose interest in human connection or beauty or the simple pleasures of physical existence. In fact, the reports consistently suggest the opposite, that after the initiation, ordinary life became more precious, not less, because it was now seen clearly for what it actually was, not a permanent condition to be clung to, not a problem to be solved, not a preparation for something better, but a gift, a specific, temporary, irreplaceable gift, the gift of a particular form in a particular place, at a particular moment in the vast unfolding of existence. A wave, beautiful precisely because it was temporary, precious precisely because it would pass. The twice born did not fear death, because they had already died, and discovered that what they were was not diminished by the dying. They did not cling to life, because they knew that what they were extended far beyond this particular life, and so they could be fully present in it, without the desperate grasping that comes from believing this is all there is, without the constant background anxiety that comes from knowing it will end. They were free, not free from death, free from the fear of it. And that freedom changed everything about how they lived. The Greek philosopher Plato, who spent years studying in Egypt, and who many scholars believe was an initiate, wrote about this condition in his dialogues. He described the philosopher not as someone who studied books, but as someone who had practiced dying, who had learned to withdraw consciousness from its identification with the body and the senses, and rest in the awareness that underlies them, not as an escape from life, as a preparation for living it fully. Cicero, after his initiation at the Eleusinian Mysteries, wrote that he had learned not only how to live with joy, but how to die with hope, not because he had been given a comforting belief, but because he had directly experienced that what he was could not die. And Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, whose Meditations remain one of the most widely read books in all of human history, returned again and again to the same theme, that death is not to be feared, not because of any theological conviction, but because of a direct recognition of what consciousness actually is. These were not naive men, not wishful thinkers, not people seeking comfort from the terror of mortality. These were among the sharpest, most rigorous, most clear-eyed minds the ancient world produced, and they all pointed from different angles, in different languages, at the same recognition that what you are is not what you think you are, that the boundaries you take for granted, the boundary between self and world, between life and death, between the individual and the infinite, are real at one level of experience and transparent at another, and that the Egyptian initiation was a technology for moving between those levels, deliberately, consciously, with full awareness of what was happening and why. Not a ritual performed out of blind faith, a precision instrument for the direct investigation of consciousness itself, the most sophisticated such instrument that any civilization has ever built. If you have stayed with me this far, if you have walked through the temple corridors, stood at the entrance of the stone chamber, and felt something stir in you as we explored what the initiates encountered inside, I want to pause for just a moment, not to break what we are building, but to say something directly. This channel exists for exactly this, not for entertainment, not for information that passes through you and leaves no trace, for the kind of encounter that the ancient traditions spent thousands of years protecting, because they understood its value, because they understood what happens to a human being who genuinely confronts the nature of their own consciousness, the nature of their own existence, the nature of what waits on the other side of the boundary that most people spend their entire lives trying not to think about. If this is the kind of conversation you have been looking for, subscribe to Sacred Flame, because what we are uncovering here, video by video, layer by layer, goes deeper than any single conversation can contain. And I want you present for what comes next. Now, there is something I have not yet told you about the Egyptian initiation, something that the priests considered the most important part. Not the 3 days in the darkness, not the crossing, not even the recognition of immortality. What came after, specifically what the initiates were asked to do with what they had experienced, because the Egyptian tradition understood something that modern spiritual culture often misses, that an experience, no matter how profound, no matter how real, no matter how completely it transforms your understanding, is only the beginning. The recognition must be integrated, brought back, translated into the fabric of ordinary life. Otherwise, it remains what the Egyptians called a dream of the Ak, a glimpse of the deeper self that fades like a dream fades as the ordinary world reasserts itself. The priests had seen this happen many times. Initiates who emerged from the chamber transformed, and slowly, over months and years, drifted back into the ordinary sleep of unconscious living. Not because the experience had not been real, because they had not been given the tools to keep it alive in ordinary life. And so the Egyptian tradition developed an entire system of daily practices designed to do one thing: to keep the recognition present, to prevent the ordinary mind from closing back over it like water closing over a stone. These practices were not elaborate. They were not time-consuming. They were not reserved for priests and initiates alone. They were designed for ordinary life, for the marketplace and the home and the field, for the moments between tasks and the moments before sleep and the moments after waking, when consciousness is still close to the threshold. The first and most fundamental of these practices was simply this, remember, not as an instruction to think about the initiation, not as an instruction to recall the experience, as an instruction to notice right now, in this moment, the awareness that is present, the same awareness that was present in the stone chamber, the same awareness that will be present at the moment of biological death, the same awareness that has been present through every moment of this life, unchanged by any of it, not enhanced by the good moments, not diminished by the terrible ones, simply present, always. The Egyptians called this practice akification, the ongoing process of identifying not with the body, not with the personality, not with the story of the life, but with the Ak, the immortal divine awareness that wears all of those things, the way you wear clothing, temporarily, for specific purposes, without confusing the clothing for the one who is wearing it. This practice did not require a stone chamber. It did not require 3 days of darkness. It required only a moment of genuine attention, directed not outward at the endlessly fascinating spectacle of the world, but inward at the one who is watching the spectacle, the awareness behind the eyes, the presence that has been here all along, the Ak, which was never born and will never die, and is available right now, in this moment, if you are willing to look. There is a moment that every initiate described, not during the 3 days in the darkness, after, days or weeks after emerging from the chamber, when the world had reasserted itself, and ordinary life had resumed, and the memory of what had happened inside had begun to soften at the edges. The way all memories soften, they would be doing something completely ordinary, eating a meal, walking through the marketplace, watching the sun set over the Nile, and without warning, without effort, without any intention on their part, it would return, not the memory of it, the thing itself, that quality of presence, that opening, that recognition, arriving unbidden in the middle of ordinary life. Like a door swinging open in a wall you had forgotten contained a door. And for a moment, sometimes a long moment, the boundary between the ordinary self and what lay beneath it would become transparent again. Not as vivid as it had been in the chamber, not as total, but unmistakably the same thing, the same quality, the same recognition. I am not this, I am what is aware of this. And that awareness has no edges, has no beginning, has no end. The priests called these moments visitations, and they considered them the true fruit of the initiation, not the 3 days in the darkness. The visitations that followed for the rest of the initiate's life, arriving without warning in the most ordinary moments, to remind them of what they actually were, beneath everything that had been added, beneath the name and the history and the accumulated weight of a human life. I want to tell you something now, something I have been building toward. Through everything we have explored tonight, you have had visitations. Not because you have been through an Egyptian initiation, not because you have spent 3 days in a stone sarcophagus, but because the awareness the initiation was designed to reveal is not somewhere else. It is not something that has to be earned or achieved or unlocked through extraordinary means. It is here, right now. It has always been here. You have felt it in moments of unexpected stillness, when the noise of the ordinary mind went quiet and something underneath it was briefly, undeniably present, in moments of profound beauty, when something in the landscape or the music or the face of someone you loved opened something in you that you could not name but recognized, in moments of grief so complete that the ordinary self had nothing left to say. And in that silence, something else, something vast and quiet, was simply there. These were not random experiences. These were visitations, the Ak making itself known through the gaps in the ordinary that circumstance occasionally creates. The Egyptian initiation was a technology for creating those gaps deliberately, for making the visitations available on demand, rather than waiting for circumstance to provide them, but the thing the gaps reveal was never dependent on the gaps. It was always there, is always here, will always be here, because it is not somewhere you go. It is what you are before the name, before the story, before the fear, before everything that death is feared to take away. The awareness that is receiving these words right now, that has been present through every moment of this conversation, through every moment of this life, through every moment of every experience you have ever had. That awareness is the act, not a part of it, not a reflection of it, not a temporary expression of it. It fully present in this body, in this moment, wearing this life, the way the ocean wears a wave, without being diminished by it, without being defined by it, without being ended by it. When this wave completes its journey, the ocean remains, and the ocean was never the wave. The wave was always the ocean. Tonight, before you sleep, find a moment of stillness, not to meditate, not to achieve any particular state, just to notice that you are aware that something is present before you decided to be present, that the awareness looking out through your eyes right now has been here through everything, unchanged, undiminished, present. That is the act. That is what the initiates spent 3 days in darkness to discover, and it is available to you right now in the next 30 seconds. If you are willing to look, not outward, inward, at the one who is looking. If something moved in you tonight, if something in you recognized something that it has always known, share this with 5 people, not because this channel needs the numbers, but because somewhere in your life there is someone who is afraid, not of something specific, of the thing beneath all specific fears, the fear of ceasing to exist. Give them this. It will not take the fear away, but it might offer something better than the absence of fear, the recognition that what they are cannot cease. Leave a comment below, not a reaction. Something real. Tell me what happened in you as you listened. What opened? What recognized? What remembered? And if there is something you want to explore next, a question that has been living in you that has never quite found the right words, leave it there, because that question might be exactly where we go next, together. Subscribe to Sacred Flame, because we are only just beginning, and what comes next goes even deeper.